Good evening. It's good to be with you today. We are going to look at John chapter 6 for the next probably 2 or 3 weeks. It's a long chapter, very interesting chapter, because we see into not only the mind of Christ but also the mind of his disciples. And some of the things that he is trying to really teach them and thus teach us. And John did a good job of recording about Christ here and his teachings. We're going to see in 6, it says this: and after these things Jesus went over to the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And it says then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those who was diseased. Now, we think of this, the Sea of Galilee. A lot of times we don't fully understand all that it is. The Sea of Galilee is the second depth as far as below sea level. Matter of fact, it's the only one that is below sea level more than it is the Dead Sea. The Sea of Galilee is some 600 feet below sea level. And then it's about 140 foot deep. So it's a freshwater lake, but it sets down in the Great Rift, where it is lower than the Mediterranean Ocean. It sets there in this rift, this torp on the earth, and it is surrounded by mountains. It is below sea level. Then some of the mountains that's above it is average 600, but even some of them, a couple of them, go much higher than that. So we are talking about almost being down in a bowl. It's a lake that's about 8 miles wide. It's about 8 miles wide, just a little bit longer than that, not much. And it is a lake that is, even today, is fished and swam in. And I've talked to people that love to go over, and they said they enjoy swimming in it, just thinking that's the sea that Christ and his disciples, fished in, probably swam in and enjoyed. But here they was in this lake. And I say lake, we call it a sea, but it's a sea by name, not by any other thing else. It is really a lake. In the Old Testament, the New Testament time, it was called. I think in the New Testament, all but Luke does not call it a sea. The others all call it, the Sea of Galilee. Now here, the multitude came. It says a great multitude followed him, not just a few. And they followed him because of what he had done. He had performed and healed the sick. And I think this is something that if I saw this going on, I would want to follow, even if I wasn't sick, because how marvelous it would be to see somebody that was lame or crippled and was able to see them all of a sudden to take up their bed and walk. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing to just watch? They was able to see this. And it says, and Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes. He just looked up, lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming towards him, he said to Philip. Now, if I was sitting there and anyone else, especially if the leader that had done what he done, all of a sudden he lifted up and got his attention, then I'm sure that the others would look and see what was he looking at. And they looked and saw the multitude. And then he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? Well, in the Sea of Galilee, where there was no large city. There's not any large city around there, not on where they was, and none really large city around. Mostly just fishing villages and where people tend their flocks. So, but this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Now, I see this, and a lot of people say, well, he tested him. Does the Lord test us today? Well, first of all, the testing was not, I don't like the word testing because we look at it two different ways. Testing, what he was doing was trying to teach him. The test was a teaching. He was using this to teach Philip. It's about like when I was the director at Black Mesa Bible Camp there in Oklahoma. I was there, and we always would have classes, and every afternoon after lunch they would take a test over the classes that they had that morning. I can remember one little old boy was upset. He came to me and he said, Mr. Carter said, why is it that you make us have a test every day? I don't like this having I like Bible class, but I don't like the test. Why do you test us? I looked at him. I said, well, Bobby, let me tell you what I'm doing. I'm really not testing you. He said, well, why do we take it? I said, I have to make sure that the people I got teaching the classes are teaching you. So I'm trying to find out if they have done a good job. This is not about, I'm not testing you. I'm making sure they are doing a good job. He looked at me and he said, well, if that's the count, I don't mind taking them. Well, and I was not making it up. I gave the test to the kids not for the purpose of them, for them and testing them, but I wanted to make sure. Because I found out if you tell somebody and give them something and you didn't give them a way of checking them, they might not teach what you had assigned to them to teach. So we was doing that. He was not testing him in the sense, he was trying to teach him. Because look at this. It says that he did this. It says, but by this he said to him, testing him, for he himself knew what he would do. He already knew the answer, but he wanted to make sure. He wanted to make sure that Philip paid attention to what was going to happen. He got his attention. It says, then Philip answered, said him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not enough sufficient for them, and every one of them may have a little. Basically, he was saying, if you look this up, denarius was basically about a day's pay, about 20 cents in American money. Somebody said, how could they live on a 20 cents? Well, we have to realize back then, if you worked for somebody, if you went to a farmer and you worked all day, they would pay you, but they also would feed you your meals. It wasn't, a lot of times we think of, well, you have to take your lunch. I used to help some of the ranchers in Oklahoma when I preached out there. When I worked and helped them, I always got at least one good meal, sometimes two, because that was part of it. That's the way it was then. You would get, if you worked all night, you would get, you could maybe even sleep in the field or in the barn or sleep with them. But the denarii was the pay that you had to keep in your pocket. So you would have to work for 200 days to get this money. And he said then there wouldn't be but just a little bit. I want you to remember this. He said, and that would only be what? He said, and that would only make them have a little. Not all they wanted, but just a little. It said one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, it said, here's a lad who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but what are they among so many? Now, a barley was something that was a grain used. Matter of fact, it was a grain that was used mainly by the poor folks. Wheat was something that was used mainly for those that was wealthy and for fine bread. But barley was very wholesome and still is barley. It says, and he has these loaves and 2 small fishes. It says, but what are they among so many? He said, that's what we have, but what is that? Then Jesus said to them, make the people sit down. And now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, and in numbers about 5,000. About 5,000 of them sat down. We look at other books in Matthew and Mark, and we find out they sat down in 50s and 100s. They didn't sit down, but they sat down in groups. It says, and then Jesus took the bread, the loaf, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, as many as they wanted. So he gave to the 12, and the 12 took to the 12 could maybe take to their 10 or so, and they gave out some, and they gave them some, and they don't know how much they gave, but they divided, they gave. Well, so what happened? So when they, so it says this, so when they was filled, he said to his disciples, when they was not when they had, now notice, not when they had eaten, but it says, but when they was what? Filled, when they was full, when they had all that they wanted. Notice, this is what he's saying. So he said, when they was full, he said to the disciples, gather up the fragment that remained, so that nothing is lost. Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the remnants of the 5 barley loaves, which was left over by those who had eaten. All of a sudden, those 5 loaves had turned into 12 bushels of bread, enough, we could say, probably to feed another meal to those people, just with that. It says, then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, they said, truly it is true, the prophet who is to come unto the world. They said, this is the prophet. Here was a man that could heal the sick, to heal someone that was hurt. You talk about a leader. Would you follow somebody that if you got hurt, if you had a sword wound, if you got the ear cut off, would you follow somebody like that? Would you be in his army knowing that if you got hurt, he was there? They had followed because of this, but then all of a sudden they saw this man that only could heal the sick, could raise the dead, but somebody that could take a few pieces of bread and could feed and give you all you wanted. Wow. You get to thinking about that. If there was an army you couldn't kill, if you wounded, could be made healed, didn't have to carry hardly any food because somebody could feed them, that might be a dangerous army to go up against. It might be a good army to be in. I say all this because I like what the conclusion was on this first thing. It says this. It says, truly, this was the disciples, the one. But then in verse 15, therefore, when Jesus perceived that they was about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Do what? He was afraid. He saw what was going to happen. He saw that these men, they was 5,000, was going to come and say, you are the king. Later on, we're going to see, when I tell you the end, where Jesus was brought up on charges that he had said that he was the king. When we see here, right here, that he was trying to flee from being made a king. Why? I think he told that Roman leader, that Roman governor, look, and you can see what he told him. Jesus, when he asked, "Are you the king?" He said, "If my kingdom was of this world, what? Then my servants would fight. If my kingdom is not of this world." We are not waiting, or should not be, waiting for Jesus to come back to the earth to be king. He's already the king. We wait for him to come back to take us to where he is. That is what is talked about in 2 Thessalonians. That's what's talked about when in Acts 2. In the like manner have you seen him go, he shall come again. We need to live because Jesus has the bread of life, and he has the gift to give us eternal life through the will of his Father, our God, if you allow Jesus to be your Savior. God be with you till we meet again.